Canada is one of the most powerful militaries in the world, at least according to this website that I totally made up. But for most of its existence, Canada was widely considered to be a military joke, even by itself. So how did Canada go from being a nation of lumberjacks to having one of the largest and most powerful militaries in the world? Well, that's what I'll explain right now. Canada's path to military prominence began with a pair of wars that I've already talked about many times before. The First World War and the Second World War. And there's a lot of overlap between the two conflicts. So, I'm just gonna kind of lump them together. The story of Canadian involvement in these wars is really one of manpower, specifically a lack thereof. When Canada first entered the First World War, it only had about 300,000 eligible soldiers to draw from. So it wasn't surprising that early attempts to raise new units were unsuccessful. However, by the end of the war, Canada had managed to raise 625,000 troops, which sounds impressive until you realize that the United States was raising about 6 times that many troops every single month. So Canada's contribution was basically nothing. Not that the Canadian contribution was any less effective for that. Canadian troops distinguished themselves in several major battles, most notably the Battle of Vimy Ridge. They continued to impress during the Second World War, fighting in nearly every major theater of war, including a large and bloody campaign against Nazi Germany in the West and a smaller but no less intense jungle war against the Japanese in the East. But while Canada acquitted itself well in battle, the country was still contributing a relatively small number of troops compared to the other major powers. In total, Canada raised about 1 million troops during the Second World War, just over half of which were actually sent overseas. Compare that to the 40 million Americans who served in the war, or the 3.5 million British troops, and you start to get a sense of just how much more the United States and Britain contributed. So why did these wars turn out so differently for Canada? Well, partly it has to do with size. Canada is a huge country. When the wars started, most Canadians lived along the US-Canada border. Vast stretches of the rest of the country were completely empty. This created some problems for the Canadian military. It had very few roads connecting its main population centers. Most of the country was effectively stuck in the mud during the winter months. And because of the country's size, supply lines were extremely long, making logistics a nightmare. These problems forced Canada to focus on developing a strong military, since a weak military would be unable to defend such a vast territory. Another reason why Canada became a military powerhouse was conscription. In 1914, when the First World War began, Canada's Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, wanted to implement a system of compulsory military service. However, he soon found out that this was wildly unpopular. So instead, he created a system of limited conscription, which only applied to men who volunteered for overseas service. Still, this was enough to raise the roughly 600,000 troops that Canada needed to contribute to the war effort. During the Second World War, Canada implemented a more comprehensive system of conscription, which required 1 in 5 men to register for military service. This helped Canada to meet its recruitment goals, though many Canadians, especially those of French descent, resisted conscription, either by avoiding the draft or by engaging in acts of civil disobedience. Finally, we have to talk about proximity to the United States. Ever since the War of 1812, the US and Canada have enjoyed a long period of peace. In fact, the two countries have become increasingly close over the years, both economically and militarily. Today, Canada is the United States' largest trading partner, and the two countries have engaged in joint military exercises for decades. These close ties have allowed Canada to develop a strong military without having to worry about being invaded by the Americans, which is nice. In conclusion, Canada became a military powerhouse during the Great Wars, despite not being a particularly large or populous country, by implementing a system of conscription, solving its logistical problems through innovative military tactics, and focusing on quality rather than quantity. When it came to its troops, Canada proved that it didn't need to raise millions of troops to make a difference in the outcome of the wars. Instead, it focused on training a smaller number of troops to the highest possible standard, which is part of the reason why Canada's military is still considered to be one of the best in the world today. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. If you did, hit that like button. If you want to keep learning, check out my podcast in the description below. And if you want to support my work, consider becoming a member. I'll see you next time.